Good morning. I can't be with you today because there's a junior high track meet over at DC West. So you'll have to put up with a taped lecture that you can feel free to stop at any time if you need to stop and take notes, or you can rewatch if you need to listen to it again. But today we want to look at the final years of World War I. We want to look at 1917 and 1918. If you recall, by the end of 1916, World War I had turned into a stalemate. Germany was unable to move Britain and France, and Britain and France was unable to move Germany. This stalemate turned into two things. One, trench warfare, and a war of attrition. The war of attrition led each side to establish blockades. Great Britain using its navy and Germany using its submarines. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, because Russia was not prepared for war, German forces were advancing into Russia. The war is going to change in 1917. Our first question today just considers why 1917 is considered a turning point in the war. In 1917, in March of 1917, Russia pulls out of the war. See, a civil war had broken out in the country. We'll look at that civil war next week. But a civil war broke out in Russia. In other words, Russians started fighting amongst themselves. And as a result of fighting amongst themselves, they were forced to pull out of World War I. This pulling out of World War I would be a great event for Germany, because then Germany would ultimately be able to move all of its troops to the Western Front, probably ending the stalemate between Great Britain and France and Germany. However, in April of 1917, the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and France. If you recall, both sides, Britain and Germany, had stopped our ships, but we were more upset with Germany for how they stopped our ships because of the use of the submarine. There's quite a few factors, actually, that led the United States into World War I after staying neutral for the first 3 years of the war. But we'll look at those factors your junior year with Mr. Cloyd when you study American history. Once the United States entered the war did not last much longer. I think you can probably understand why. The United States was no longer selling supplies to Germany, and fresh U.S. forces now coming into the Western Front, as well as total support production-wise to Britain and France. The first U.S. troops arrived in Europe in early 1918. President Wilson, President of the United States during World War I, hoped that this war would be a war to end all wars. He had hopes that by the United States participating in this war and the terms that would be reached at the end, that no future wars would take place in Europe. But when the United States arrived in Europe in early 1918, the stalemate is over. Austria-Hungary is defeated. There are British, French troops in Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is defeated. The fighting is still taking place in the Western Front, and Germany is being forced to retreat back. However, they are still in France, but they are being forced to retreat back. It's at this point in November of 1918, matter of fact, on November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Germany signs a ceasefire. The ceasefire was known as an armistice. Now, this armistice signed between Germany, France, and Britain leaves a question. Did Germany lose? Or did Germany simply quit? Remember, as you're asking yourself that question, Germany was never invaded. If you recall, all the warring parties in Europe believed this war would be a short-lived war. They believed the war would only last 3 or 4 months. And what do we find? The war lasts from 1914 all the way to 1918. Let's take a second and look at the human cost of the war. Again, the key to remember is that this war was only supposed to last 3 or 6 months. Russia would suffer the most. 1,700,000 soldiers were killed along the Eastern Front. Nearly 5 million soldiers wounded. Remember, Russia was not prepared for war. Germany lost nearly 2 million soldiers. And a little over 4 million soldiers were wounded. France, where a majority of the fighting took place in World War I, lost 1,300,000 soldiers, and over 4 million French soldiers were wounded. Britain lost nearly 1 million soldiers, and just over 2 million soldiers were wounded. Recall, these are the 4 countries that participated in the war the entire time the war took place. We didn't enter the war with men until 1918. So we were in the war less than a year. The United States lost a little over 100,000 soldiers, and almost a little over a quarter of a million soldiers were wounded. It's obvious when you look at the human costs of the war was much more costly for Russia, Germany, France, and Britain than it was the United States. I think that's going to play a role into the treaty making process. See, the United States and the other warring nations in Europe are going to have different ideas of how the war should end. But when it came down to it, 4 countries basically wrote the treaties. I imagine you can guess those 4. Britain, France, Italy. Remember what Italy had done during World War I. They were originally a member of the Triple Alliance, but they never did join Germany and Austria-Hungary. Instead, 10 months into the war, they joined the side of Britain and France. And the United States. These are the 4 countries that primarily wrote the treaties that would end World War I. What do they have in common? They're all on the winning side. They were known as the Big Four. Well, our country's president, President Wilson, travels to France to take part in the treaty-making process. And his view of how the war should end is different than how Great Britain, France, and Italy see the treaty-making process. See, the United States, remember, came into this war hoping that this war could end all future wars. To prevent all wars in the future, the United States' idea was to create an atmosphere where there would be no hard feelings. Now, recall the death toll. Recall the number of soldiers that were killed. Great Britain and France and Italy are not going to agree with the United States. The other 3 members of the Big Four are going to want revenge. They've lost many men. Many men have been wounded. Much money has been spent. Much property has been destroyed. They want revenge. They want to punish Germany. They want to punish Austria-Hungary. They want to punish the warring countries. 3 want to punish. 1 wants no hard feelings. You're all in high school. You can do the math as far as who's going to win out. Great Britain, France, and Italy are going to see this as an opportunity to increase their imperialism, increase their power, because they're hoping to gain some land. So let's look at some of the specifics that were put into these treaties to end World War I. There wasn't one treaty, even though we call it as the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was actually made up of several treaties because each country that was defeated had their own treaty. Let's look at the Ottoman Empire, or what we call Turkey. Recall, the Ottoman Empire, not an original member of the Triple Alliance, but does join Germany and Austria-Hungary. But remember what was happening to the Ottoman Empire. It was falling apart. The Ottoman Empire no longer was going to be allowed to keep forts. They were no longer going to be able to fortify that narrow strip of land between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, one of the most important strategic locations in southeastern Europe. Turkey was no longer going to be able to fortify. Turkey lost almost all of its land. The Turkey that you know of today basically was created in this treaty. All the other land that Turkey or the Ottoman Empire still had was handed over to the winners. 4 new countries are going to emerge from the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria also has a separate treaty. If you look at the map on the right, you will see that Bulgaria has access to the Black Sea on the east and the Mediterranean Sea on the south. Bulgaria is going to be forced to give up one of those entries to the sea. That southern strip of land in Bulgaria would be given to Greece. Let's look at Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is going to be divided into 2 nations. You're right, you guessed it, the nation of Austria and the nation of Hungary. However, that large chunk of land, Austria-Hungary, isn't going to be divided into just Austria and Hungary. Austria-Hungary is going to lose the rest of their territory. Do you remember how Austria-Hungary had many different ethnic groups within its country? Many nations are going to be created out of what used to be Austria-Hungary. Germany had their own treaty at the Treaty of Versailles. As you look back at the history of World War I, in your viewpoint, who started World War I? Was it Serbia? Was it Austria-Hungary? Remember, Austria-Hungary was the first country to declare war. They declared war on Serbia because of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. When the Germans came in to sign the treaty, they were shocked at what the treaty had stated. Germany had to admit to starting World War I. Now you know, when you admit to starting something, you're taking total responsibility. So Germany had to take total responsibility for starting World War I. They were forced to pay $33 billion in reparations. In other words, Germany was expected to pay the winning countries $33 billion. Why $33 billion? That is how much the winners considered that they had spent on the war. And since Germany started the war, Germany would have to pay for the war. Germany also was forced to relinquish land. Do you recall, right before World War I, Germany had taken the areas of Alsace and Lorraine from France? You can guess what the French wanted. The French wanted Alsace and Lorraine back. Italy took some land. So Germany is going to lose land. They're also going to lose over all their overseas colonies. All the colonies Germany had worked hard to gain would be lost. Remember, that's why Japan entered the war, in hopes of gaining German land. Germany also had to agree to limit the size of its military. Remember, how did France and Britain and many of the other European countries feel about Germany's rapid growth into a power? France and Britain didn't want to see Germany ever rise up to being a power like that again. So Germany had to agree to limit the size of their military to a defensive military. And the natural resources Germany was so blessed with having on the western side of their country, known as the Rhineland, because it sits along the Rhine River, Germany was not allowed to fortify that region. It's pretty obvious. All the losing nations of World War I are going to be punished. But who's going to be punished the most? Who's going to be punished the most severe? Germany.